Aidan and I go back a long way. I think it's over 30 years that we first met. And just to follow from what Dermot said in terms of the nature of the man, I must have done so many things during that time to annoy and upset him. And not once did I ever see any indication that he took upset at something I may have said or done. Incredible patience. And he was just a joy to be around and a joy to work with. Never a cross word. And if there was a deadline to be met, you could be absolutely sure that Aidan would meet that deadline, and the work that was submitted would always be of the highest quality. I think more than anything, what I want to talk about tonight are not the many very tangible contributions that he's left behind in terms of books and in terms of research articles, but instead the more nebulous legacy that Aidan has left to psychology in Ireland. For him not to be around anymore is still very difficult to comprehend. I know it's been a difficult summer for many, many people, but to imagine the summer that Angela and Kevin must have had to endure is very, very difficult. I could talk at length about his research. I could talk about, as I say, that the tangible contribution, the concrete contributions he made in terms of books, in terms of articles. But instead, I want to dwell rather more in terms of the way that he conducted business. His legacy, I think, more than anything else, sets the path for us in terms of 3 words: simply doing it right. I know we're living in a world at the moment where politicians are very fond of 3-word catchphrases, and I'm slightly reluctant to throw another one into the mix. But maybe if some of those same politicians were to abide by this maxim, we might not be in such a place as we are. But without question, whatever Aidan did, he did it right. There were no half measures. There was no bluff and bluster. What he said he did, he did. And I say, during all that time I knew him, I never once found an occasion where he deviated from that path. There was one time, though, that does stick in my mind. We used to meet quite regularly at a halfway house in Dundalk for a chat. It was supposed to be about work. More often it would have been gossip and catching up, and maybe quarter of the time spent talking about work. But on one occasion, I saw what I thought was a slightly darker side. And that was, we ordered lunch and sat down to have lunch, and Aidan very quietly called over the waiter and asked him to take the chips back. And the reason why was because they weren't quite right. He didn't make a song and dance about it, and it was the only time I saw any evidence of that side of the man, which actually said, he wasn't a perfectionist certainly, but was saying, no, it had to be done right. And what does doing it right mean? Well, for somebody who's an applied psychologist, it means you have to do things in the right order. Sports psychology is notorious, I'm afraid, for people who work under the title but don't necessarily follow all the rules. The rules are quite simple. First of all, to become an expert practitioner, the first stage has to be that of becoming an expert. And Aidan did that in spades. First of all, at his time at Galway, then at his time at UCD, and it was only then that he felt that he was in a position to move to stage 2. And stage 2 was then about putting that theory into practice. It's not a case of going out there and learning on the job. It has to be that you go with the credentials behind you, with the knowledge behind you, which you then have the authority to translate into a meaningful and accessible form for those people who don't necessarily have that background. When I think of Aidan, there's one psychologist who immediately springs to mind with me. and it might seem not a particularly obvious one, but it's a person who may have shared a haircut with Aidan, but didn't have much else in common. He came from a social psychology background, but he was a tremendous applied psychologist through the war years. Those are two quotes from Lewin, who couldn't imagine a world where you didn't simply apply the knowledge that you had accumulated. There is almost an obligation, once that knowledge is there, to give it out, to give it away. So there's no research without action, there's no action without research. And why a theory is there? The theory is there to inform practice. And from my experience of working alongside Aidan, that was something he did with such consummate ease. He had that knowledge, but he was then able to package it in a way that people readily understood. And what I'd like to spend some time doing this evening is just looking at the ways in which that knowledge should be packaged to ensure that sports psychology continues to have a healthy future. These are quite difficult times for the subdiscipline, I must say. For a long time, performance enhancement was sufficient, helping teams and individuals realize their potential. What's emerged over the last while, though, is a darker side of sport. And the darker side is where winning at all costs has become the mantra. And the price of success, well, the money is crucial in this. I'm not sure if you've seen this graph before. It's one of these that at first glance looks quite simple, but what you have in actual fact are two separate sets of data here. One in terms of UK sport funding, which is the dark blue line, and the other are the total number of Olympic medals won, which is the lighter blue line. And the really scary thing to see here is how those two lines perfectly match. Over that 20-year period, as more and more money was pumped into sport, so more and more medals were won. So success comes at a price. And what has emerged over recent years are the number of people who have had to pay the price for that success. And without naming names, half of the people on this screen paid the ultimate price. And increasingly, sports psychologists are being asked the question, was it worth it? Have we gone too far? Now, I was given a very stark reminder of this a couple of years ago when we were over in Australia visiting our son and his family. And on a Saturday morning, we went along to the local swimming pool to see Ted have one of his first ever swimming lessons as a 2-year-old. And festooned around the walls, this was running up to Christmas, were messages like this to remind these young athletes what it took to get to the top. Now, I don't know what you think, but I find these absolutely terrifying. Are you prepared to pay the price? Do things other competitors don't. Be unrelenting in your quest for perfection. All of this is creating a climate, a culture where the price that people end up paying can be considerable. And what you're also seeing coming into the lexicon of sports psychology now are more and more clinical terms, some of them exclusive to sport, others more general, but reflecting on a sporting population which increasingly seems to have to be protected from the worst excesses of sport. And I think it's little wonder that in this climate, what you're finding is the growth industry at the moment is not sports psychology, but sports psychiatry, fixing the problems that sport has brought along. If I hear another professional athlete talk about sacrifice and hard work and hardship, I think I'll go mad. This is supposed to be fun. This is supposed to be something that you enjoy. And then during the time that Aidan and I would be working with athletes, I think it was that element which was uppermost. I think as time's gone by, that element has tended to shrink. And if we really want to preserve Aidan's legacy in terms of the translation of theory through to practice, I think what we have to do collectively is look at the ways that we can create an environment where people in sport, whatever their ability happens to be, can be well and stay well, can enjoy their sport, and at the same time have an opportunity to genuinely explore whatever their sporting potential happens to be. So to start this journey, there's a need to look at, I think, a number of fundamental questions. What is it that you can do? Well, in terms of putting messages across, certainly it has to be tailored to the particular audience that you're working with, say the age, the level of ability. But what you can never do is try to persuade somebody that they are better than they actually are. All you can help them do is to explore what their potential may be. Who should do it? Well, without question, it has to be people who have the surety that their knowledge base is rooted in the science of psychology. And this is something that has bedeviled the subdiscipline over so long, where people have peddled their wares without necessarily going through that rigorous apprenticeship that I mentioned before. And how should you do it? Well, I'll come on to that in a moment or two. First of all, when you're out there in the field, the first thing you have to acknowledge is that whether we like it or not, everybody is acting as a sports psychologist. They might not know they're doing it. They might not be doing it in the best way, but they still are influencing the people that they talk to and the people that they work with. And some people do it very well without ever encountering somebody from sports psychology. Here's a classic example of somebody from the world of basketball, John Wooden, who had no background whatsoever in sports psychology, but so much of what he did intuitively was right. And if you ever get an opportunity to look at any of his work, you'll see why, in so many ways, he passes the test. These are just some quotes from the man that would sit easily within any sports psychology textbook. So as we start this journey then, in terms of doing it right, there has to be a sorting of the wheat from the chaff. The things that people think are good psychology and the things which actually are good psychology. These sorts of quotes are the things you'll hear day and daily around sport. Think about it. One of Aidan's bugbears. Very often, if you want to be performing well, the last thing you want to be doing is thinking about it. Focus, I'll come back to that later on. Focus is only one of many attentional styles that people should be employing. You're only as good as your last game. Constantly keeping people on edge. The reality is you're as good as your best game. That gives you some indication of what your potential may be. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. In other words, that there is an elite, there's a small group of athletes, of players, who when the chips are down, will produce the goods. And that constrains so many other athletes who would like to be performing at that level, but maybe have been influenced from an early age to assume that they never will. And the last one, going back to a theme I've already mentioned, that in some way this has to hurt. No pain, no gain. And what you have to do when you're trying to promote good sports psychology is cut across these, cut through these, and look at lessons, at principles that stand the test of academic scrutiny. One thing that Aidan had, which I was always incredibly jealous of, was a huge encyclopedia of sporting anecdotes. for every situation, he seemed to be able to pluck one. He must have spent hours poring over papers to find these quotes. And this is one from him. Over the years, we would have shared slides backwards and forwards. And this one comes from a guy that actually both of us worked with. In the late 80s, we were employed by the IRFU to work with the Irish team. And it was actually a fascinating time, because it was a time when professionalism was coming into the sport. The players welcomed what we were doing with open arms, but probably wasn't true of management. Management probably hadn't got to that point and saw it probably more as a threat than an opportunity. And there was one occasion where it was actually a match, I think, against Canada, that at the very last moment, a member of management told Aidan and I that we would have to try and find our own way to Lansdowne Road, as we weren't going to be going on the bus. And spontaneously, I made a decision to pull the plug. Hadn't consulted Aidan, and as I mentioned before, I tried to rile him, but even on that occasion, he turned the other cheek and we walked away. I'm sure he had things to say under his breath, but I never heard them. But this quote from Wood is an interesting one, because clearly he's larger than life character, really nice bloke. But what he tried to do from an early age is, if something went wrong, he tried to make amends. And what that does is often, as he says, compounds the error by making it more likely, if you try to make amends, you'll do something even worse. So what did he say later in his career? He develops a routine where he simply clears his mind and then focuses on doing a simple thing well. Now, that didn't necessarily come from psychology, but it's those sorts of intuitions that you don't ignore, that you build on in trying to create an environment where people have the opportunity to explore. Here's another one from Jack Nicklaus. Again, not informed from psychology, not put into psychobabble, but very much conveying a sentiment that a sports psychologist would support. That nervousness, that anxiety, that pressure is something that you welcome. It's not pressure. You look at it as fun, you look at it as excitement. In actual fact, that's why you're doing it. Another example, this one slightly closer to home, from Rory McIlroy. Had a disaster at the US Masters, if you remember. Then went out to Tahiti as a UN ambassador, saw the levels of poverty there. And those are two quotes from him not long after, as a masterstroke actually by his manager at the time, because what it did is put his feet firmly back on the ground. So through this, through an athlete's career, what you will often find is things come along which can knock them off balance, can elevate them maybe above their station. And this step, in terms of doing it right, is so important. It's about staying grounded, being true to who you are, never getting too full of yourself. And I must say, as somebody who doesn't, although my wife and I have lived here now for over 40 years, you can tell my accent, not from here originally, but Ireland is a great place to do sports psychology, because that groundedness is never too far away. There's never somebody too far away who can pull somebody back to earth. And I think it's such an important ingredient in terms of doing it right. The next ingredient is one I've already touched upon, is that it's easy for those, I think, who have been through the mill and can look down from on high to assume that you've either got it or you haven't got it. Brian O'Driscoll, absolutely fantastic rugby player, fantastic bloke, but he in this quote, he confirms this impression that you've either got it or you haven't. Players see it, they just know the ones that will stand up to be counted and the ones that won't. And that is great for those who have this attribute, but for those who don't, what it can be is a huge burden, because then you've either got it or you haven't. Now, I much prefer this quote from Di Green, the 400-meter hurdler. What he said is a lot of people, including his coach, says you've either got it or you haven't. What he says, no, you can learn it. Now, whichever side of the argument is true, what you need in terms of to be able to progress with athletes and players is exactly what Aidan had again in spades. It's that positive belief that you can affect change. If you believe that what's in front of you is preordained and can't be influenced, then in actual fact, you may as well go home. You've got to go in there with a belief that there is a potential that can be explored, that there are attributes, there are skills that can be built upon, including mental toughness. Here's somebody that would make an interesting case study in many ways, Roy Keane, who reckoned that one of the most important times in his career is when he wasn't playing, when he was nursing a knee injury. It gave him time to figure himself out and to start to build that mental toughness that he needed. And he wouldn't be alone in that regard. Many top athletes would talk about occasions where they had the time out, and it was the time out that gave them the opportunity to reflect. And here's someone who Aidan worked with, especially early in his career, a guy who was always willing to learn, who puts into words another of these important steps, these ingredients that's important to make sure that it's done right. You've got to dare to lose. There's no point in being comfortable, otherwise you end up as mediocre. But reaching greatness requires falling off the edge a load of times and then getting back and getting on with it again. So the third element of the one you've already seen, no pain, no gain, no brain. What you should be endeavoring to do through this work is not make it a job of work, but try whenever possible to keep it light. And again, Aidan had that remarkable capacity for lightness. I think that's why I was so shocked by the end. I knew that Aidan had been going through such difficult times, but he bore his illness with such lightness that the end then was so unexpected and must have been so difficult for so many people who knew him. In terms of keeping things light, what this means when it comes to practice is the focus shouldn't be on quantity, it should be on quality. And working with coaches, it's very often a question of finding ways of keeping activities fun, making sure that they're not routine. So you hear some of the characters in the past from sport. One of my absolute heroes is Brian Clough from football. You've probably seen some of the films and read the books on the man, but one of the things that you could never say about him is that he was predictable. So people would turn up for a training session and they hadn't a fully notion about what was going to happen. But you could make sure at the same time he knew what was going to happen, and he would make sure, although it was different, that the work was quality. Now here's a character that Aidan and I would have talked about very often throughout his career as it meandered along. A guy who learned eventually, I think, to keep it lighter. But this is from an early stage in his career where he had an encounter with a sports psychologist, and clearly it wasn't particularly positive. Later on, he hooks up with Ivan Lendl, who you wouldn't have thought was the most fun character in the world, and yet what was his message to Andy Murray? It has to be fun, make it fun. You feel nervous, obviously, but if you didn't, there'd be something wrong. The privilege of pressure, as they talk about. And once you start enjoying it, that's when you can play well. And I don't think it's maybe any coincidence that it was only later in his career that Andy Murray started to show his true potential. Another ingredient, as I rattle along through these, is the focus should never be on the result, but it should be always on the performance of what eventually takes you to that result. And here's a quote from one of the legends of American football, Vince Lombardi, that was thrown at him throughout his life. Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. In actual fact, in his later life, he openly admitted that he regretted ever saying this. It's not about the end goal. Sorry, it's not about the end itself. It's not about crushing human values and morality. Instead, the journey itself is often just as important. And just to look at the practicality of how this can be delivered, this is based on the work of Richard Butler, which I know both Aidan and I were very impressed by, where to visually capture this, what you can do is you present, say, a whole list of sporting attributes around a dartboard, and you just say to the athlete, right, where are you? Where do you need to be? And very quickly, what you can do there is capture a goal setting program. Here's a quick example of a golfer where you need probably about 3 dartboards to capture all these, but through various conversations decided these are the attributes that he needed to work on. Where am I? Where do I need to be? And this is again one of the slides that I quote borrowed from Aidan over the years, a quote that he found from Mark Williams, that to avoid thinking about the end and instead keeping himself in the here and now, Mark Williams repeatedly sang Delilah to himself during the World Snooker final to keep himself in the present. Now, when you start to put these ingredients together, you need some sort of framework. And I found, again, we'd have talked about this over the years, these 3 questions in particular are the most vital in terms of foundation that athletes can work from. First of all, a very simple question, one of motivation. Why are you doing this? With so many athletes, you find that they may be dragged into a sport because they happen to be good at it. They've got an aptitude for the sport, or they have significant others who drag them into it. Until they do it for themselves and for the love of the sport, there will be problems down the way. So why am I doing this and who am I doing this for? It has to be selfish and it has to be for love or enjoyment of the sport. And what I would often use is when I'm working with athletes on this is looking at the delay time when you ask that question, because they often know what the answer should be. But if it immediately comes to mind, that means they're there. If they have to think and make a conscious decision about what to say, then you know there's trouble down the way. And the third question, which ties in with this, is the one of identity. Because again, through an athletic career, there are so many pitfalls that people can unwittingly fall into or trip over. And one of them is pretending to be somebody else. So much more important that the person has a very strong sense of their own identity and they don't lose sight of that as they go along. And in terms of this framework to put around these various ingredients, what athletes will often talk about is the second one down there, confidence. They'll go and see a sports psychologist because their confidence has taken a hit. What you actually find is when you start to unpick it, it's a combination of these 3 ingredients: control, confidence, and commitment. And they've got out of balance in some way. So maybe their commitment has waned or it's become too powerful, which in turn then has impacted on the level of control that they feel they have, or their control has taken over from commitment or has had an influence or confidence, or in one way or another, the balance between these 3 has been upset. And it's only when the 3 work in harmony within a culture where challenge is the predominant feature that you'll really start to see people realizing true potential. And without introducing too much of the theory into this discussion. When you look at each of the C's, what you find from there, but it has to be brought in or borrowed from right across the psychological spectrum. It's maybe no coincidence that Aidan and I seem to work quite well together because we came from such different backgrounds. I came to Queen's in 1980 and we started working together in the late 80s. My background was social psychology, his background cognitive psychology. And what you find is that sports psychology is actually a natural breeding ground for so many different perspectives and so many sides of the discipline. Causal attribution, so critical when you're thinking about this first C, control. If somebody has got an exaggerated external attribution style, what it means is it's never their fault. So in terms of control, they never take control because it was never them. It was always the pitch, it was always the weather, it was always the referee. And these people can be so difficult to work with because they have the excuses there. The one who has an exaggerated internal attribution thinks they have control of absolutely everything. And that can be equally difficult. And then when you look at this in terms of success and failure, what we each have embedded within us is this self-serving attributional bias, whereby we tend to externalize failure and internalize success. And often the key to a successful intervention is making sure that that balance is right. And another interesting attributional issue is that called the fundamental attribution error. In other words, if you're a spectator, you're more likely to attribute outcomes to internal factors. And if you're an actor or a player, you're more likely to blame external factors. And so a lot of the rows and so on that you'll see in clubs and between teammates often comes down to this. Were you there or were you there? Were you involved or were you watching? And what I think is so important to bear in mind with this, it is not just a question of borrowing from theory to put into practice. What practice very often does is then help to advance theory. So in the literature, what you'll see around attribution is a discussion of NH and FF, need to achieve and fear of failure. And again, I remember discussions of this with Aidan. What you actually find with a lot of elite athletes is they will still talk about fear of failure and think it is something that they need to keep them going. And what you try to do with that is move it to the next level, which isn't fear but hatred. To hate the prospect of failure but never to be afraid of it. And similarly, need to achieve assumes that this is imposed on you in some way, instead of which internalize that and it should be choose to achieve. One aspect of sports psychology that Aidan was particularly interested in was the impact of anxiety or stress on performance. And in terms of this first C, control, taking control of stress is hugely important. So much has been written about this over the years. I think we both eventually came to this to the opinion that this approach probably is as close as possible to helping to pull together all that literature. In other words, everybody has an idiosyncratic zone of optimal functioning, as Yuri Hanin called it. In other words, don't assume that you can apply a formula to 2 people, 3 people, 10 people, because they will each be quite different. And the task of a sports psychologist very often is to find out what a particular zone is, how that individual responds to stress, and then to work with that zone and try to recreate the circumstances where that zone can be hit time and time again. And through the history of sport, you find examples of people who intuitively came to realize this, but often very late in their careers. Often the task is to truncate that process, to bring it forward so people can learn the lessons at an earlier stage. The second C, confidence. As I've already mentioned, it's often the thing that's first brought to the practitioner. When in actual fact, too much confidence can be just as dangerous as too little. It's the balance between the C's. So can do it is often sufficient, not will do it. That's the pedestal that you're waiting to fall off. And daring to lose by wanting or choosing to achieve and hating the prospect of failure. The third C, commitment, motivation. The Mr. Motivators that abound across sport have spawned no end of legends in terms of some of the antics and the tricks that they get up to. Again, something that we would have discussed at length. One thing what you try to do eventually is wean people off the idea that motivation is about content, and instead think about the process of motivation. The content would assume that it's like a glass of water. So somebody who is committed to sport is therefore going to be less committed to their work and so on. And yet the reality is that people who are highly committed to sport will also be committed in other life domains. And this is an example of an approach which has been borrowed from occupational psychology that we would have used. Porter and Lawler's model, which looks at the relationship between the effort that people will put in, which then reflects in performance, mediated by the ability that they have and the role they play, the rewards that they assume, and satisfaction. And as a diagnostic tool that coaches and managers, for example, could work with, incredibly useful. Through a sporting career, so many things can come along to interfere. The money is probably one of the biggest you find with professional sports people. Phil Taylor was an example of somebody who let the money get to him. So what did his manager do? Told him whenever he won, take the money to the bank on a Monday morning, put it in the bank, and then forget about it. And his mantra was, think poor. And what Taylor then managed to do was rediscover his form. Because what he actually did was he got his buzz out of, for a non-contact sport, this is actually quite interesting, but essentially beating up the other player, waiting to see when their guard had dropped and then going in. You wait for the dip, then you hit them hard. And another example, Teofilo Stevenson, fantastic boxer, had an opportunity to turn professional on numerous occasions, turned them all down. And that's just, I think, such a lovely quote because he had it right. He had perspective. More locally, Tony McCoy, early in his career, he would agonize over every mistake he made. So you need the hunger, but you need to make sure that it isn't all consuming. Try to let go. And it's interesting that at long last in sports psychology, you're now starting to see this discussion by people like Robert Vallerand of the distinction between two types of passion, the harmonious, the good, and the obsessive, which can be frightening. And again, between the two of us, we would often have discussed examples of people who got it wrong, of coaches who terrified their athletes, their players, because they seem to be so all consumed by their sport. This was a slide that I'm not sure that Aidan particularly liked, but anyway, when you try to put this into words, it's to try to capture a lot of this in terms of how you would sequence the approach to actually performing or playing. Once all the work has been done, all the practice has been done, you want to go in with a clear head. And that just, number one, just about sums that up. And then when you're performing, very often thought will slow. So you reserve judgment, you park it during performance, and then it's afterwards that you have reflection. And that sequencing then becomes something that becomes routine over time. In terms of an area where Aidan was definitely in his element, it was this one, about various ways in helping athletes to think positively. And these are just a few practical examples that he and I would have used to help people put to rest very often mistakes, drawing a line, even a little smiley line on the back of the hand, positive images to remind people of different discussions beforehand, buzzwords, singing, sometimes to clear their head. Short, simple images or messages to help people keep that positive mind frame. These are just 4 quick examples of people that I'd worked with. One was the Irish squash champion. The last thing she would have done was put a hand on the door before she started to play. And it was just a quick reminder to say, thank you to everybody who got me here. Now I'm on court doing something I love. The Irish surfing champion, what she did just before she competed, just put her head underwater, just to remind her she was out there in the elements doing something that she really enjoyed. The dolphin was, again, a really good swimmer, just had it as a key ring. So the last thing she looked at before she dived was a recognition of that feel that she wanted going through the water. And the last one is one I've mentioned a number of times. This was a guy who rang me just before the All-Ireland final. I knew him well from his time at Queen's, and he'd lost his, he was a free taker, he'd lost his form, and he wanted to know how to get it back. And we chatted about what he used to do when he was a youngster. And he used to sing that song to himself when he kicked through the ball. So the intervention was very simple, just use the song again, and it worked. This is one of Aidan's exercises that I know he used routinely. Turning things around, thinking positive, thinking of a pressure situation you dislike, turn it round. So instead of I hate the pressure of, turn it to I love the challenge of. Something that's under your control. And I haven't got time to go into all the ways in which imagery can be used as this positive force to help people think positive. Those are just some of the examples I know, and based loosely on work on functional equivalence, it's work that Aidan would have taken to the next level, and to have helped establish Ireland very much in the Premier League in sports psychology, virtually single-handed. The general message with all of that work on imagery is it's positive imagery that works, not the negative, which is what often people are inclined to resort to. And there's a quick example from again, Nicholas. Never take a shot, even in practice, without having that sharp focus clearly in mind. And when it comes to focus, I mentioned this very early on, and I'm going to try and wrap up as quickly as possible now. You need to look beyond the word. Focus is only one of a number of attentional styles. If you take an example of basketball, if you have somebody who's too narrowly focused with a pair of blinkers on, they're going to miss out on so much. And so, rooted in all the various explanations of attentional style, in particular the work of Niederfer, what Aidan would have talked about instead is that movement between styles, between looking outwards and looking inwards, between having the broad and the narrow, and encouraging athletes to then move easily between each of those styles as needs dictated. And focus, that narrow external focus, is only one of that whole range of styles which are available and should be available. And here's a quick example from cricket. Gary Sobers, one of his innings, I think, was about 365. How did he manage to stay so alert? Because he knew intuitively, you turn it on, you turn it off like a shower. It has to be fresh and ready when you need it. The last step, how do you deliver on all of this? Well, the last thing you do is bamboozle people with science. And this is where Aidan really had this off to an absolute T. You don't go in there and try and confuse. You keep it simple. You are confident in the fact that you have that knowledge, and then you express it in a way which is easy and which is accessible to people. And over many, many years, Aidan did exactly what it says there. He did it right. And I think on behalf of that whole psychological community in Ireland and beyond, and that whole sports psychology and indeed sporting community, all I'd really like to do is just thank him for that huge contribution. And responsibility, I think, rests with us to carry forward the legacy that he's left us. Thank you.